All right, welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us. You're watching Morning Cafe. Today is World Radio Day. This is a day celebrated annually on February 13th, and it's just to celebrate the enduring significance of radio in our lives. And this year's theme is radio and climate change. Of course, just to highlight radio's pivotal role in disseminating information. And who better to have this conversation with than Victor Bwire, that is the Director, Media Training and Development at the Media Council of Kenya. Karibu sana, Victor, to studio.
Pleasure.
Now, you see, as we mark World Radio Day today, right, we also celebrate the legacy of Leonard Mbamba Botela. I want us to just start at that particular point. You've been in the media space for years. What do you think made Botela such a formidable voice in Kenyan radio?
Thank you. And obviously, before the discussion, I want to send our condolences to the family for losing Mzee. Mzee Leonard Mbamba Botela was a winner of the veteran journals category in the annual Journals of the Year award that is organized by the Media Council. He is one of our winners. Yeah. We honored him for the great work he had done. And obviously we'll miss him. He has written a book actually, which I was reading yesterday on Jehu Ungwana, a whole book which we will read. Yeah. Now, obviously, Leonard had a way of telling societal issues in a very, what now we are calling storytelling approach. He had a way of picking, researching on common things that happen within our society, especially negative things that we needed to stop. And he would present it in such a manner, away from the voice, the authenticity, and but he had a way of narrating the stories that many times you want to relate with, or you have a brother or a sister who does such a thing. You know, you see it. He would bring you to the crime scene, as it were, and you are seeing it. Then with that powerful voice, then he gives examples, and then obviously ending with the correcting what ought to be done, the correct thing to be done. And it helped a lot that many of the things were things that happen within ourselves. And he would relate with the audience, his audience, in so an easy manner that we are missing today. That many, as you said earlier before we started, that many of us journalists are now Gen Zs, and sometimes they have a good story, it's good, a topic, but the way we relate, we are in a hurry, that we never give ourselves time to relate, and that storytelling approach, that connecting, that many times we are doing stories for the sources. I mean, that you do a story and you tag a source, Victor, who was your guest. But Leonard could many times relate with the audience, tell people what they want to hear. You know, those, like a pastor in charge, you know, that you pick things that you observe every day in a matatu, in a market, in a church, and those that are very negative. And he used his program, Jehu Ungwana, with his radio in a very powerful manner, interesting, but at the end of the day, he delivers a message that behavior you are doing is not good.
It's not good.
So it was not just crime, the big things, but even societal, like you mentioned, societal things. Watoto wanavuta bangi, you know, those common things. Mtoto wanatoka shule afanye homework, but he would, you know, remind parents of their responsibility, remind in a very, very powerful manner. So that approach is away from now where radio is, that approach is missing in our radio. That storytelling, that relating with the audience, that addressing one person. You know, nowadays we even talk about my audiences, my listeners. Yet in radio, you only address one person. And when, for example, Leonard Mbamba was doing his programs, he would pick Anne or Victor and talk to you, though it touches other people. But you will talk to you. But right now, you're just saying, wapendwa wasikilizaji wangu, you know, and all those things. So those are basic things that we need to relook, even as we grow, as even we have Gen Zs in our newsrooms. But you would see how he maintained. I was listening to Bach Machoka in the morning, and they did a program for almost 22 years. You know, when he was doing the Jehu Ungwana and Machoka was doing the Sanyo Top Sanyo for 22, maintaining an audience for that year must be not magic, but a way you would maintain. Right now, we do a program for a year, we change, because we can't sometimes maintain audiences.
Yeah.
So we just need to relook and say, how do we do programs in a way that we talk to a person?
Yes.
Yeah.
And clearly, you've mentioned quite a lot, looking at today's media landscape, a lot has changed. And whose responsibility is it actually to just ensure that we maintain, because looking at Mbotela's area, they were very keen on addressing these societal issues, addressing societal etiquette. But right now, that is a little bit out of place. It's missing. So whose responsibility is it to ensure that we are back on track?
It's a 360-degree responsibility. And you have a responsibility. You as a journalist.
Yes.
The station has a responsibility. The Media Council has a responsibility. The training colleges have a responsibility. Because we can't allow you. You might want to do those stories because you also notice, like, for example, Leonard Mambo, his program was sponsored.
Yeah.
You might be struggling with a program where you don't have resources to maintain that program, to do what you really wanted to do. So if the station is not facilitating you to do some of those things, then you might not do. But also, we in the industry do we have the passion to be journalists? Do we have the passion to tell those stories the way? Do we have the patience, the flexibility, the interest? Are we in journalism because we are looking for celeb, or are you in journalism as this job that you liked and wanted? So that then it's not a one-person responsibility. It's a whole responsibility. If you are given such a big, nice studio and you have no resources to go and get that story, it might also frustrate you yourself.
Yeah.
So we need to look at media sustainability and sponsoring public interest journalism, that those societal problems like Namambo were mentioning, who among the public institutions or maybe sponsors or can be able to partner with TV47 and produce it. Not because they want to advertise their things, but because they think this is wrong. So that's our problem. But the bigger thing is journalism, professionalism, because there's a way we have just dropped off from doing the work. We are not doing the right thing. We are doing things rightly. And for that reason, if Anne has been making a mistake, I do a mistake because Anne has been doing it. So at what level as we journalists, that peer review mechanism, do you have editorial meetings? Do you have, like if you finish this program, when do you have a review? And say, Anne, today how are you hosting the program? On the Muli. So that many of us are journalists. The time you're in this studio, once you have hosted Victor and you leave the gate, you become a milk seller, there's no journalism you are doing any other more. So that the time you give journalism is so little that professionals are good. But there are people who are really journalists all their time. And you have seen your colleagues. I'm sure you have a role model somewhere else in CNN, CBS, who you think, if I did this like, and I could see Johnson Mwakazi, for example, and Indimuli, one time when they were hosting, you get them, even on the road, they are walking but they are practicing something. You see somebody saying, today I didn't get it, I want my program to be going. And it comes, some of these things you learn, it's acquired, you are not born with it. But many of us have no time for that. Many of our journalists are brokers, they are chasing everybody in town. So that sometimes even good journalists, we lose them, not because they are bad, but the time they have. You are hosting Victor for World Radio Day. What research have you done? So that even the program, the program becomes not the program itself, but the content of our discussion even disappoints people who wanted to listen. So those are times that we are saying journalists must spare time. If you are a journalist, you are a journalist. Spare your time, spend your time doing your work. Sometimes you don't just leave the studio to go and idle in town. Listen to some of your programs you have done to improve, because it's an improvement process.
Yes, a personal initiative, you say. Interesting. So even as we transition into today's theme for World Radio Day, radio's role in climate action, why is it important that we now focus on radio as an agent of climate change?
Big time.
Addressing climate change issues, rather.
Yeah, big time. That media all the time, even TV, have to focus, set an agenda, frame things that are global, that are affecting the communities. Because that's why I say that we as media, even as radio, they must focus on things that are affecting the community. Because the community is your audience. So if you are speaking to things that are not major things. If you are focusing on mganga kutoka Tanga, those gambling things, I mean, sometimes you lose your audience.
Yeah.
But if climate change is a global thing right now, as it was a few years ago, it used to be another topic, international news. Even you editors could put it in international news because of climate change. But gradually, climate change is affecting everybody.
Yeah.
It's an agenda for each of us in whichever way, and it becomes a global, national, domestic issue that merits attention by everybody. Radio has no option but to help. And why radio? Radio. As it was the Media Council research of 2023-24 said radio is the most at 80% reachable by Kenyans. While TV is the biggest source of news for Kenyans, but in terms of reach, radio is at 80%. A very big rural bias that is listened to big time in rural areas. So what other medium would we suggest? And now with the climate change, the discussions around pollution, the discussion about flooding, food insecurity that's affecting everybody, radio becomes a central player in any discussions. And many of the discussions are now around climate change, big time, is the issue of adaptation. And adaptation means that we have accepted that climate change is a problem we are facing. How do we cope? And how do we then involve communities in helping? This is not a government problem alone, a civil society alone, a media thing, it's everybody's thing. So radio becomes critical because if it's reaching 80% of Kenyans, obviously it's a bit, not cheap, but a bit affordable. Radios are now on phones, big time. We now have accessible. And now with nearly 300 radios in Kenya, with nearly all 47 counties, save for 2, having at least a radio, local-based, vernacular, community radio, it becomes a big medium that can be helpful in the discussions and debates around and public education. The other thing is also mobilization. We need a critical mass of people who appreciate that climate change is a challenge that we need to. So that mobilization, radio becomes very critical to us. And obviously, as I mentioned, as we move away from mitigation measures, moving to adaptation measures, people need, where I come from, people in Badalang need to be told how to live with the floods, because the floods will never end. Sometimes it's rain, sometimes it's backflow from the lake. When Uganda, for example, closes its dams for clean, the problem becomes, so flooding will be there, but how do we help those people to live with those floods? That when they're coming, they can move on higher grounds, they can, So that's why radio. And you remember even WHO jointly with the Meteorological Department started radio stations in areas that have different disasters. There's a radio in Budalang called Bulala FM, that's to help people during floods. There's a radio here in Moranga, landslides. There's a radio in Suswa, Narok, because Narok also experiences a lot of the breaking of the road in Narok, so that people can. So that's why radio is that critical.
So do you think Kenyan radios, as it stands now, looking at this year's theme, are doing enough to create awareness on climate issues?
From the study we just did a few months, which might be launched today, radio is doing much, yes, the coverage is there, but there are a lot of gaps in how radio is covering climate change matters. We established a trend where radio treats climate change matters as an event. There's a World Radio Day, there's a Climate Day, there's a Mazingira Day, there's COP, there's a lot of attention. But once that is done, nobody bothers about. Like we covered COP29. Radio has not followed up with the commitments that were made there to see what is being done by governments and all. So it's a very event-oriented. It's a very personal approach. Again, when the president is making a speech, we listen to him. When the minister, but once that is done, again, nobody follows. That, like what the victims go through, what other experts in climate change are saying, radio doesn't give any space. So we see those gaps, which also we are not blaming radio so much. We're also looking at how much has this journalist been trained on climate change. So that then, because climate change is a specialized area, how many of the specialized journalists do we have in our newsrooms? So what capacity building efforts If we are being told there's a climate change matter in Taita Taveta, you want to go and do a story, how much of your editors are willing to sponsor you and go and do that story? So there are also other challenges that we see. So much has not been done. Radio can do more by giving more space, especially the community radio. And we have 57 community radio stations in the country. So if they involve the community, the audiences, the experts, the victims, the debate will be a bit different. So more can be done.
So that's a great point, by the way. So what would you say that, or what would you suggest that radio should prioritize so that we can move away from just reporting on disasters and now come towards inspiring real action?
And that's what we are saying. The issue of adaptation is about inspiring stories.
Yeah.
You remember we have talked about solution-based journalism, constructive journalism, development journalism. That these problems are there. The floods in Tana River are there. The mudslides in Moranga are there. Some of these things are natural. But what can be done? How are communities then dealing? And stories have been told about the women in Kilifi and Kwale who are doing the mangrove forest and doing the carbon trading. And they're doing so well. So, you know, they have just done that. So who else is doing such? I know of families now in Budalangi that have moved away from just picking the mud and catfish from the floods into doing now fish ponds, and are surviving, you know. So there are good stories that can be told. I know now communities that were initially along the lake they are now doing, for example, fish cage farming, just in realization that sometimes the rivers and the lake sometimes are not reliable, and sometimes it costs them. So there are a lot of communities are adopting. The Ogiek, for example, have their own radio station, Oserian FM in Mau Forest inside. And what they have been doing is to talk about how the communities can live with the forest, that you don't necessarily need to destroy the forest. And you will see many times in Mau, the Ogiek people rarely destroy the forest. They know how to live. It's us externals who have bought land there and who destroy that forest. So communities have known how, and that traditional knowledge. I know there's the rainmakers of Kakamega, for example, though they are called the rainmakers of Kakamega, but they are largely in Vihiga, and how they are helping, they are working with the meteorological department just to see how traditional knowledge can feed in scientific knowledge and predict the rains. And once they do that, they help in the issue of timing of harvesting, farming, and they have improved food security in their area. So there are a lot of positive stories that can be told. And that's our urge, that journalists also move away from this adversarial approach to only negative things. Whenever the Serikali's idea thing come up in Kano, there's a lot of attention. But what are other people, for example, positively dealing with the issue of climate change?
Yeah, you've also touched on training on climate reporting, and we agree that radio is business, and you see media usually chases what it sells. So should we be talking about packaging how these climate journalists or climate reporters should now package how they report on matters climate change differently in order to also just the listener asikia aelewe ni nini tunaongelelea?
You see, the good thing that has happened, Anne, in journalism is that we are gradually moving away. The advertising model alone to sustain media has failed. And gradually, many of the media houses are coming back to audiences that now, like the print media, they are now coming back to selling the circulation figures, not necessarily the advertising, because a lot of issues have happened, reduction in government, revenue, reduction in revenue from, for example, because of competition from digital platforms. So media are also realizing that good public interest journalism can also sustain a media house, not necessarily advertising, not necessarily. When we treat news as a product for sale only, it's not sustainable. That journalism is not, as it were, it's not that profit-oriented thinking. That there are some stories you must do here which have no profit. I mean, if you looked at every story in terms of how much money it brings to this station, you'll close this station down. It will not, it's not sustainable. There are stories you must just do for public interest. There's an accident, the president's addressing the nation. You know, you can't say there's no advert, State House brought here will not cover it. So the model of just looking at every story in terms of advertising can never work. But you will see a lot of your good stories. that your journalists just go out in public interest about climate change, food insecurity, health, sometimes also attract readers. And once they attract those audiences, sometimes they maintain you here by way of how you are using the subscription model and other things. So media houses must also move away from one approach to business. That every story, I was talking to the MD, Mwenda Njoka, the other day when we were launching your studio here.
Yeah.
And the discussion is that partnerships are also helping. And TV47, for example, can work with a climate change organization, climate change activists, to do stories around climate change that still also will attract yourself resources by the way of partnership, not necessarily advertising. So we just need to be aware, because you can't run away from climate change. As people are looking at it previously, was just about weather and climate, but climate change is a cross-cutting matter. It affects health, it affects transport, it affects food security, it affects almost all types, it affects your dressing and everything. So it's not a topic you can say a few people listen. It's everybody's business. Yeah. There's the politics of climate change, for example. When Trump, for example, says they are not giving, they are not honoring the commitments they made, it's a political story. When, for example, and there's also accountability issue. There's a lot of money coming to climate change. Following up how the trail of that, how money, accountability, how that money is being used by national government, by counties, it's a big economic story. So it's we the journalists who must get climate change is even in sports. You have seen because of climate, football being some matches being pushed because the match could not go on. So that's the way we journalists look at how we package. Do you want to give the climate change a health angle, a food security angle, a political angle, and an economic angle? And we move on.
Still on the matter of training, and you've mentioned something quite interesting, that a lot of money is being put towards climate change. And would you say that we should now incorporate climate reporting into journalism schools as compulsory now, in order to just ensure that journalists are not thrown into climate reporting, or they go there because there's a lot of money here and they're going to get maybe money from it?
We might not make it compulsory because, for example, in most of the universities, their programs are approved by the Commission for Higher Education and their Senate. I mean, but a lot of institutions, for example, the Media Council of Kenya and FAO and National Treasury, we have developed a curriculum on climate change reporting. I know we have done some trainings for journalists on climate changing. I know Kenya Editors Guild have done some work on training journalists on climate changing. And what our newsrooms ought to be doing also, I know there are some universities that have adopted climate change as a topic. You know, in many of our universities, specialization is a challenge. I mean, we are trained as general journalists. But now at a private, and there are so many courses online, free online on climate reporting that journalists who are interested can do. So it's also about us as journalists. What is this public interest thing that is now affecting our communities? When COVID-19 was an issue, everybody became, you also reported on COVID because it was no longer now health reporters alone. Why aren't we treating climate change as such that it affects everybody? How many, for example, Monday to Friday, guests do you bring to the studio to talk about climate change? You know, those are the discussions, just mainstreaming climate change programs and discussions in our program. We'll have done but we can have 100 programs on politics, but we can never have, sometimes we don't have even a single program on climate change discussion. And those are some of the challenges. And the discussions are not just about one directional, because the research we did was a lot of stories about the government, when the government is going to cope, when the government is planting trees. But we have a lot of experts who can talk about climate change, and especially the adaptation measures we are talking about, the positive things must come from experts who are working in research institutions with the communities that are succeeding. So how many times do we bring, even, I was asking yesterday in one of the discussions, for example, when floods happen in Budalangi, we look at people running. Has anybody ever done a story on how people with disabilities survive in that, or Kano, for example? You know, we always show people with bags, bicycles running away. We have never focused on maybe a person with a disability and what they, you know, there are those specific specialized challenges that people with vulnerability go through in such disasters.
Yeah.
But we rarely do that. So there are a lot of things we can do so that we also start helping communities understand that when, for example, a flood happens, we need to take care of people with disability. We need, in a different way, more than this one approach, one group approach. Yet in those communities, we were discussing about floods in one time and the demand for condoms going up in a room. And if you read in all humanitarian approaches, when people are affected with disasters, including the floods, and that was a story in Kilifi, the demand for such things go up. Why? When people are stressed, when people have nowhere to sleep, you know, and you start seeing that condoms become one of the disaster items when you are going to a disaster. But somebody who doesn't understand will not. So those are the kind of discussion we are talking about. That it's not just, for example, when floods happen or when other disasters like in Muranga landslides, tell me when a person who was taking maybe HIV drugs and his house has been swept away by landslide, what then happens to that person immediately? You know, so there are people with vulnerabilities who have other extra challenges when some of this climate change. We are talking about Kwale, for example, and the gender aspect of climate change. That when people have cut down almost all our trees, and communities, especially women and daughters, have to walk a very long distance to look for firewood. You see, now how does that daughter study? How will he compare with the brother who is sitting and he has gone for 30 minutes to look for firewood? When they are cooking, remember they're exposed to carbon monoxide when they're using firewood. Who is affected, who has more health challenges is the mother and the daughter. So, you know, in a hospital, for example, when there's a disaster and floods come along with waterborne diseases, who are more affected? Children. Who takes children to hospital in most of our communities is the mother. Now, if the mother spends 3 days with an admitted child in the hospital, who goes to the shamba in our communities is the mother. You see, food security, health is affected. Yeah, so we need to look at this thing in a more broader sense and more discussions about climate change so that we don't limit it to a few things that is to work.
Interesting. And looking at countries like France and Canada, they have experimented with a funding model where independent media houses are getting grant for environmental journalism. And is this something that you will say that maybe Kenya could explore, or are we already exploring such?
I know, for example, the Media Council of Kenya runs grants. We give journalists some grants to go and do environmental stories, and they have been doing fantastic work. So every 3 months we give some grants to about 20 journalists. You bring a story idea on an environment, there's a judging panel that looks at the idea. If it's good, we give you some little money. And other people are doing, I know Kenya Editors Guild, I know other institutions, Aga Khan University has been giving a grant. So a lot of people are doing that in a small way, but it's a good model to help people focus on the environment. I know even politicians in the US gives grants up to Kenyan journalists who are interested. So the bigger thing is on the journalists to create bigger interest and understanding on climate-related topics. Sometimes not the resources alone. Sometimes just because I sometimes see when we run those grants, call for grants, the applications sometimes are very weak. You see somebody trying to connect a story, but it doesn't come out. You know, somebody's struggling. Yet you see a big story in it. You know, there are big stories like now in Taita Taveta, where if with the threat of climate change, if the springs, especially Mzima Springs, for example, runs dry, and you see it provides water to Taita Taveta, Kwale, and Mombasa, what then happens? You know, those are big thinking that people can track, and a lot of springs in Taita Taveta have dried up. Who is following up? You know, so they're interesting stories away from the bigger political statements around climate change, the commitments around COP, the bigger threats at a local level that people need to localize and talk about and help people start thinking about how do we conserve these springs. And remember, I was talking about traditional knowledge. What were our traditional knowledge doing to preserve those springs? There's a way these communities used to do it. So how do we, who is this journalist following up some of these things that we are talking about? You know, what is this tabia mbaya that is leading? If we are unable to clean Nairobi River, sometimes you ask yourself, this is our capital city. If people are just serious, it will take how many days to clean this river? But you can see the commitment, half commitments, half seriousness, the people who benefit. Go to Kisumu, the most polluted lake in the world is Lake Victoria. So that sometimes you find water in Kisumu is 100 bob a bottle, 500. Yet a soda is 27 shillings. Why would a soda be cheaper than water in Kisumu, Siaya, Busia, which are just at the lake? So you start also finding, but Lake Victoria is one of the most polluted lakes. And just a few last year, November, people who are trying keg farming along that lake lost over 22 million because the pollution affected the fish kegs, the missed oxygen, and they died. So at what level? And you see, once that dies, it's like an economic story. That pollution then leads to people losing 22 million who had taken loans and the rest, and that's a huge economic loss. So how do we relate climate change stories to economics? People are now talking about the loss and damage. Who understands those things? Carbon credits. Even us, at our level, we are struggling. What about the communities that we want to get involved? Look at the Mazingira Day, a very bright idea, but the way we have sold it, just a day. Yet, if we looked at it and involved the community to appreciate that this is not just about a national holiday, but it's purely an effort towards climate change adaptation, the result will be different.
It could be something. You've mentioned something quite interesting, and this one is for the journalist who's watching right now. You've said applications sometimes are weak when journalists are applying for these grants. So how does a stronger pitch look like for a journalist, a climate reporter watching right now and is looking forward to applying for these grants? One,
what is the story? And that's an old name, an old thing in journalism. Yes. What is your story? Because if you are writing about Moranga landslide, you are not the first person who is writing about that story. People have written about. So this time, and you are applying this story. What is this we are telling us about that Moranga landslide or whatever? You must tell us, or the breaking of the road at Suswa. So you must be clear in your mind. What is the message in my story? So that clarity of mind becomes critical. What is the justification for this story? Why would I pick your story and not mine? Because it's a competition. So what is this unique thing in this your story that is not in the other people's story? So that uniqueness that people write, you go to, for example, a road accident scene. There's a journalist who will pick to say, kuna ajali hapa, naona ambulances zinakuja zinapeleka watu hospitali, which is common. But a journalist who will maybe take an angle and say, this spot, how many accidents have happened here? How many, because he did background. When you are just sent, there's a road accident at Suswa, or maybe it used to be Sakyangwani. You do a background check, how many accidents, how many people have we lost, what has been said about doing that. So that when you are on the site, you are telling people a few different things. Instead of just telling people, tunaona ajali hapa watu 10. In any case, we even quote people about watu 10, you are quoting who? An eyewitness. Officially, you only quote a medical doctor about how many people died. So there are those unique things that sometimes we ignore, that we do things in a very casual manner. So structure, when do you want to run the story? Why did you pick the story? How many sources, for example? A good story must have at least 4 to 5 sources. And what are these unique? Sometimes you collect so much information, but you are not sure. So in your pitch, you must also tell us who you are talking to. Because sometimes you are doing a very good story on climate change, but you list a few of your sources. The people you want to talk to is a majority leader, an MCA in a county. So we are looking at, if we really want to tell us about pollution or politics, these plastic bags in Kenya, will be an MCA be the best source, for example? So we start also asking the people you have listed as your sources, are they relevant? Is NEMA there? Is the Minister of Environment there? This would help because why are we doing the story? It's to help educate people. It's to help give people new skills to change their behavior. But if you are bringing sources who will not add value to that, then the judges obviously will not look at it. So the story might just be the same, but who are you listing as sources? What is this unique? What is unique about plastics today? And you see a story that, yes, we are doing stories on plastic, all of us, But Anna has a unique approach to this story than Victor's, and you have to speak. So we must rethink and think. Some journalists have just become a return to sender. Just go online, pick information using AI and throw to you. You read the story and say, hey, this guy had said he wants to do a story on pollution or something on rice in Kano. Yeah. Is there anything? You know, you can't see data, you can't see voices of people talking. So sometimes that is also the challenge, that we must push there, we must be there. If I want to pitch a story on something, I must do proper background research, understand that, even visiting there, a Reke visit so that I understand, so that when I'm trying to convince you, even as an editor, that I want some resources to go and do a story, you feel compelled that this is a good story for our audience.
All right. Victor, as we close, let's talk about the future of radio. We are seeing a younger generation moving to podcasts and YouTube. Would you say that you see radio still being a very dominant force in shaping public discourse in the country?
Big one, for years. Because as you have said, look at podcasts, for example, and I'm nothing, they're good, and some of them are even being integrated in radio. So it's just about an issue of integrating. You remember we were talking about an integrated newsroom that will use all this. Look at the studio you launched the other day, TV47 launched a studio, the IP studio. It will still need those podcasts. And so the future of radio is big, because also look at the audience. How many people go to YouTube in Kenya? Cost of bundles, literacy levels, and blackouts and what. So that then when you are saying YouTube is coming podcast, but how many people can access in a country where what is our literacy level? What is our money? You and me can get some bundle of Wi-Fi in the office because it's free. How many people come? And we have already said radio is purely a rural based. So how many of our rural communities have Wi-Fi's and bundles, and our mother, their age, can they manage? So radio is still there because of accessibility, portability, reachability, affordability, So radio is still there. The thing that is happening, that radio has already also embraced technology, which, remember, radio used to be for the ear alone. Right now, radio is both. The people are now dancing, they're going live with the radio. So the matcha that the people behind radio are adopting to technology, they're using new technology, they are making those strides to integrate. Many of the radio stations now have YouTube channels, they have Facebook channels. So you won't say that this radio has no YouTube channel, so I'm going to YouTube, So the radio is still there for the future.
So what's your message to journalists and radio listeners as we close?
The bigger thing to me, both the journalists, is let's focus on public interest. Let's do stories about our communities, about the public, not necessarily stories about ourselves, about our personal frustrations, about what we missed. Let's look at the bigger picture and do stories that benefit our communities. Media is still a very trusted source. While people talk about Kenya media in all whatever they say, but studies are still showing media is the second or first trusted source of people. So let's maintain this trust by giving professional, public interest stories. Audiences, and I've seen it elsewhere, audiences will support us if we are giving them stories that affect them.
All right, thank you so much, Victor Bwire, for this insightful discussion. That is the Director, Media Training and Development at the Media Council of Kenya. We hope to see even stronger climate reporting across our stations. And even remember, today we were just honoring the legendary Leonard Mamba Mbotela. May he rest in peace. Happy World Radio Day.
Happy World Radio Day. Thank you.
All right. Asante sana. We take a break at this point. We'll be right back.